Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this wonderful session where you may have noticed Marion trying to get this book in frame. I'm sorry that it just is a bit. There it is. Look, Slow Cooked: An Unexpected Life in Food Politics. That's what we're here to talk about. My name is Raj Patel. I am a research professor here at the Lyndon Baines Johnson School of Public Affairs, and I'm very pleased to be talking to Marion Nestle. Now, if you don't know Marion Nestle is Paulette Goddard Professor of Nutrition, Food Studies, and Public Health Emerita at New York University. But you know her from everything from her seminal study of food politics called Food Politics, to her evisceration of the soda industry, soda politics, her study of actually what our animals are eating, her studies of conflicts of interest. Marion has been really the founding professor of food studies, and in fact that's what we're here to talk about. So Marion, it's just so lovely to see you, and lovely to have this conversation. Welcome to the Oxford Real Farming Conference.
Well, I'm very, very happy to be here with you, and it's a special pleasure to be talking to you, Raj. It really is.
So, Marion, one of the reasons we enjoy each other's company is because of something that appears early in the book, which is communism. Now, it's worth sort of flagging here that neither of us, and this is going to come as a shock to possibly no one who knows either our work, none of us is a flag waver for capitalism. And we find many things wrong with it. And I wonder, Marion, actually, if you might be able to just tell us a little bit, as you do at the beginning of the book in passing, how you came to think about capitalism from the outside when so many of us are so immersed in it that it seems like the natural way to be.
Well, I was brought up in a family where my parents were members of the Communist Party, and they weren't very happy about capitalism, but they were very specific about what it was about capitalism that they didn't like. And they didn't like its unfairness. They didn't like the way it treated poor people badly. It didn't like the way that it exploits workers. It didn't like the enormous disparity in wealth. And these kinds of things made sense to me as a child. They made really very, very good sense. It seemed, yes, if you want to live in a world, you want to live in a world where everybody really does have a chance at getting ahead and doing the kinds of things that they want to and having enough food to eat and all of those other good things. There were other things about my parents' party membership that were much more difficult for me, even as a child, because their values and the values that I had adopted as making perfect sense, and I still think they make sense, didn't jive very well with what was going on in the Soviet Union at the time. And I had, even as a very young child, fairly difficult conversations with my parents about how they were reconciling the killing of the Jewish doctors, the pact with Hitler, the other kinds of things that were going on during that time didn't make any sense to me. And I didn't think that their explanations or their rationales made much sense. So it added to there was a great deal of conflict in my family as I was growing up, and which I also thought was very unfair.
But your management of conflict is something that oddly comes out really well in this book. That in a way, it appears that there's a line between the conflict that you talk about in your formative years and some of your ability to be able to navigate the institutions in which normally, some of us have found ourselves in very bitter fights with those organizations and have lost woefully. And you've mastered it. And I wonder if there's a line there between your experience of food and food systems and conflict as a child and the founding of food studies. I wonder if that makes sense at all.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure it does. Or I never thought about it that way. And it's interesting to me to hear from readers of my memoir, what strikes them, and this is the first time this particular issue has come up, but the managing conflict issue. Uh, I never thought I managed it very well. I cried a lot. I mean, I talk in the book about instances in which I was just completely brought to tears. It seemed to me that being angry about what was going on would have been a much healthier kind of emotional response to it, but somehow anger wasn't something that was allowed in my family, and instead I just dissolved in tears. I mean, I can think of examples which I talk about in the book. The when someone when I was working at Brandeis University on the faculty, and and somebody else was doing exactly the same job that I was doing, was paid a third more than I was paid. And I found out about it. And instead of dissolving and thinking this is the worst thing that ever happened to me and I'm furious and I'm really upset, I thought this is a gift. Finding out about this is an enormous gift. I'm going to get this fixed and I'm going to end up making more money, which I did, although it took a very long time. But so I had patience, and I think I always knew good advice when I heard it. I could tell the difference between good advice and bad advice. And over that particular incident, I got very good advice, which was you don't want to take on the department. You don't want to go to court. You don't want to fight this in any overt way because you will lose as a result. Faculty members who fight their departments and fight the administrations end up not having jobs and not being able to be hired anywhere else. And so I handled it, I thought, and was advised to handle it this way. I just said, I just kept saying, I don't want to make a case of this. I don't want to take this to the affirmative action committee. I don't want to take this to court. Please don't make me take this to court. But I was fully prepared to go to court if I had to. Underlined.
And there's a story behind how it is that you came by the knowledge that the colleague in your department was earning a third more than you. Can you tell us about that? Because again, this brings us back to the idea of comrades. How did you find out?
Oh, it was just the most wonderful story. I got a phone call one night. This was in the early, the late 1960s, early 1970s, and I got a phone call one night from a friend I knew, and I was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and she called and said, "Guess what my women's consciousness raising group was talking about last night?" And I knew she was in a consciousness raising group, and I wished I could have been in one. But I had two small children and had a lot of babysitting responsibilities. I couldn't imagine why, what she was going to say. And she said, "We were talking about your salary at Brandeis." I said, "What? How could you possibly be talking about my salary at Brandeis?" And it turned out that the girlfriend and later wife of the man who had been hired at Brandeis and was paid so much more was so horrified by the fact that he had negotiated a higher salary and had been told by the department chair that under no circumstances was he ever to tell anybody about it. She was so appalled by that she discussed it with her consciousness raising group, and they agreed I should be told. And I mean, I don't know whether she checked it with her boyfriend at the time or not. He was the first person I talked to the next day and I said, "I'm going to make a big stink about this. And how do you feel about that?" And he said, "Go for it." So in a sense, he was on my side too. He had told the department chair that he was planning to marry this woman, and that they were planning to have children, and that therefore he needed more money. I already had two children. And when I pointed that out to when I went to talk to the department chair about it the next day, he just went absolutely ballistic. Salaries are private information. Brandeis is a private school. We don't have to talk about salaries. We don't talk about salaries. They are absolutely not to be discussed. His salary is none of your business. And besides, he's going to have children and needs more money. I already have children. But you have a partner, he said. So that was that. And that was when I started on, I really, really don't want to take this to the Affirmative Action Committee. I really don't want to take this to court. I meant it. I was totally sincere. I really didn't want to do either of those things, but I was fully prepared to do it if I had to. I knew I would win.
That this is a book, among other things, about patriarchy and about your constant battle against patriarchy. Um, and I wonder, if that's again, I'm just sort of thinking about the sort of socialist politics with which you grew up. Helped inform that understanding, and that and again, the comrades in the consciousness raising circle were also. The way you talk about them makes it seem like they were also imbued of similar politics. I wonder if there's a politics that precedes the food politics that you might be able to talk to us a little bit about.
Well, patriarchy was normal. It wasn't anything that you rebelled against. It was normal. It was the way things were. When I was in high school, I tell this story that my three closest friends in high school had as their lifetime ambition marrying a professor, a doctor, and a rabbi, respectively. And that's exactly what they did. They had very clear goals and they achieved their goals. I didn't even have goals like that, but I didn't know you could. But certainly women weren't expected to work and have careers. Women were expected to get married as soon as possible, have children as soon as possible, and support their husband's work if they were going to do anything. When I went to my 25th high school reunion, there was only one other woman in my class who had a career. We both had doctorates, and we were the only ones. And I had gone to an academic high school in which everybody went to college. And if the women worked at all, they worked in their husbands' businesses and helped their husbands with their business. So the expectation was never that women would do anything. It was really, you just assumed that you weren't going to be paid well. You were going to have some kind of lesser position. And if you did have a position, you weren't going to get credit for the work that you did. If you were working with a man, the man was going to get credit. That was normal. And to think that you were going to change society on your own was certainly not something that I considered as anything possible for me. I didn't have, I've met women since who grew up in families that were academic. I came from a very poor family. I was the first person in my family to go to college. But I've met women from academic families who had much higher expectations for women even then, and their daughters went to medical school or went to law school or somehow managed to be one of three medical students in a class of 150, three women medical students in a class of 150, and were able to do that and survived it. But I didn't have the courage or the support system to do anything like that. So I just said, this is the normal situation. And I did what I had learned to do growing up, which was to try to make the best of whatever situation I found myself in and try to make it work. And I think that's what I did. I never, certainly when I was young, I certainly didn't try to do any system changing because I didn't think it was possible.
No, well.
That's why.
Can you well, we'll get to that in a second. But I'm also curious about the story of food here. About you discovering food at a comradely camp when you were young. Can you tell us that story? Because we've talked a lot about the politics, and I think it's only fair that we bring the food in just a little bit.
Yeah, I was sent to a summer camp that was run by members of the Communist Party who were friends of my parents, and the camp took in children of communists who were being persecuted at the time. My parents were not leaders; they were rank and file members, and so. I wasn't allowed to talk about the fact that we got the Daily Worker delivered to our house, or that my parents were members of the party. But everything, they weren't persecuted. I wasn't worried that they were going to be arrested and sent into jail. Whereas the other kids who went to this camp had parents who were jailed or were underground or were in hiding or really had terrible things happen to them. And as it happened, the people who ran this camp had lived in China for a while, and the woman who ran it was a fabulous cook, and she cooked Chinese. And so she could, she made fabulous woked vegetable dishes, and there was a big kitchen garden. And if you were a good camper, you could go out in the garden. You were sent out to the garden to pick the vegetables for dinner. And I remember going out I was a good camper. I went out and I picked string beans. And it was July, it was hot, and the beans were warm from the sun and extremely crisp and rather sweet. And I had no idea that string beans tasted like that, or had that kind of texture or flavor. I had only eaten canned string beans. This was before we had a cross-country system that delivered vegetables from California to the East Coast. And I had no idea what fresh vegetables tasted like when I was growing up. And so this was an astonishing experience, a transformative experience. And the food, there was not too long ago a reunion of this camp at the library at NYU, which has collected the papers from various kinds of political camps, and people got up and cried about how upset they were that this camp was their refuge in childhoods that were filled with terror that their parents would be taken away from them. And so their memory of the camp was as a refuge. My memory of the camp was that the food was fabulous. And people were quite surprised when I told them that. Maybe they had better food at home. I don't know.
Well, but this story of food, though, is one that you take a detour through, an engagement with and a career in biochemistry before you move into thinking about food not as its component molecules, but as an experience and as a thing that is shared over a table. Can you perhaps tell us a little bit about that journey?
Yeah, I actually went to college thinking that I would study food. But there were only, because my mother had a friend who collected cookbooks. Ooh, how I wish I had them now. And she said, you really should go study food. Well, there were two options. You could study agriculture. I went to Berkeley. I was a student at State School, Berkeley. And you could do agriculture, but I was a city girl. I didn't get the whole agriculture thing until much, much later. Oh, or you could be a dietetics major. And I was a dietetics major for exactly one day. The classes were like home economics, and we had to take a really serious chemistry class, and that I was really interested in. And we had a 5-credit chemistry class that met 3 times a week and had 2 laboratories. It was really a big class. Pre-meds and science majors took that class. And I thought, if I'm going to be taking that kind of class, I'm not going to be majoring in home economics or anything like it. So I became a science major. And majored in science, and then graduated in bacteriology, it was called at the time, and worked for a couple of years as a lab technician, and then was pretty unhappy. Then I had kids for a couple of years. That didn't work very well. I'm a stay-at-home mom. I was not very good at it. And some people said, you should go to graduate school. I went to graduate school in molecular biology. So I have pretty serious science credentials in my background, and I describe myself as a lapsed molecular biologist. And for people who know anything about the science of DNA, RNA, and proteins, I was a nucleic acid enzymologist before there were restriction enzymes. It was really antediluvian times. But yeah, I graduated. I have a degree in molecular biology. I don't regret it for a minute. It was really terrific training, and fabulous training for somebody who studies nutrition, because I learned how to read papers and evaluate science papers quickly and firmly, and right away I can do it. And that's been very useful, and nobody messes with me about science. They may disagree with my opinions. But they certainly can't argue with the kind of science that I report in the work that I do. So it turned out to be very useful.
But after that, you found yourself working with old ways, or rather being invited to um, discover the world of food with an organization called Old Ways. And I wonder if you could tell us what that is and what you learned as you spent time with them and then parted ways with them.
Well, this was already much, much later. I had by that time gone through a postdoctoral fellowship. I'd been given a nutrition class to teach. I had a job uh, at the University of California, San Francisco School of Medicine, which was its own experience with patriarchy. Uh, I worked for the government for a couple of years, and then I landed at NYU. And landed at NYU as the chair of a home economics department, which is kind of ironic. And pretty early in my time at NYU, and this was the late 1980s, I got involved with a group called Old Ways Preservation and Exchange Trust, which was a group that was interested in promoting healthy diets, healthy traditional diets. And they ran fabulous conferences that brought together cooks, chefs, academics, food writers to talk about what healthy diets were about and how important it was for healthy diets to be delicious. They were particularly interested in the Mediterranean diet as an example of a healthy diet. And uh, we went on fabulous trips to Morocco and Tunisia and Spain and countries, not coincidentally, where olive oil was done and olive trees were grown, because the main sponsor of Old Ways was the International Olive Oil Council, which is a group affiliated with the United Nations that is basically a trade association for countries that produce olive oil, with the objective of trying to clean up some of the problems in the olive oil industry. There's a lot of concern about fraud, where Spanish olive oil is actually made in some other country, or Italian oil is made in Spain, or whatever. So the Olive Oils Council's goal was to promote consumption of olive oil. Old Ways' goal was to promote healthy, sustainable diets. And they picked the Mediterranean diet as an example, which is interesting because it still works as an example of a healthy and sometimes sustainable diet. And so I went on to all these places where olive trees were grown. And sometimes to places where they would like to sell olive oil. There was one fairly hilarious meeting in Hawaii with Japanese people, cooking school people, to try to convince Japanese cooking school people that they should be using olive oil. So this was my first introduction to industry-funded activities as well. And I certainly took enormous advantage of that. And it took me a while to realize how uncomfortable it was. And that it was my first experience with conflicts of interest over food industry sponsorship. And it also took a while to figure out that maybe this was not something that was going to, I was uncomfortable being photographed at tables where there were bottles of branded olive oil. I didn't want to be associated with specific brands, and that was sort of part of the quid pro quo. If you were a writer, part of the quid pro quo was you had to write about the trips and say nice things about olive oil. For academics, it was a little bit less pressured, but even then. I was uncomfortable about it really from the beginning, and I stayed with it for as long as I could, but then finally had to leave it, and really haven't had anything to do with them for a very long time. No.
Well, I'm curious about that, just because this understanding of how our nutritional information is shaped by conflicts of interest is something that you've you've continued with, and you were in the Guardian, I think, yesterday or the day before, reporting on industry funding in nutritional knowledge. I wonder if you could just bring folk up to speed on how it is that industry shapes what we believe to be healthy and how that may not be true.
Well, the way I like to put it is that food companies are not social service agencies. They're not public health agencies, they're businesses. And as businesses, their job is to sell as much product as possible so they can make profits for their stockholders. And once you understand that that's the purpose of a food company, then a lot of things that they do make sense. And one of the things that they do is to sponsor research. So I actually edited for Old Ways a set of research papers on the Mediterranean diet that was sponsored by the Olive Oil Council. I was warned by the people who ran that journal that that the optics of this were not going to be very favorable, but I didn't get it at the time. I mean, it really took a while to understand because I thought I'm not influenced by the Olive Oil Council. And in saying that, I was doing exactly what the recipients of industry influence always say, is that they're not influenced. But in fact, the research shows that they are. And every Monday on my blog, foodpolitics.com, I usually post something about industry-sponsored research. I have no trouble finding articles that, I mean, really no trouble. They get sent to me all the time, each one funnier than the last. I mean, I think some of them are very, very funny. So I'll get a study that looks at, I think, the cognitive benefits of eating almonds. So people who eat almonds have higher cognition. They're smarter. Okay. And so they do the research. They set up the question. And if I see a title of an article like that, my first question is who paid for it? And if I know who paid for it, I can predict that the answer is going to be favorable to the sponsor's interest. There are exceptions, but there aren't very many. There are exceptions. But in general, industry sponsorship gets the answers that they want. And the purpose of the research is not to promote science. The purpose of the research is to promote sales of the product. So I get letters from trade associations and food companies all the time saying, we've got $50,000. We're looking for studies that will demonstrate the health benefits of our products. I get letters like that all the time. Well, they're not going to fund anything that's not likely to demonstrate a benefit. So of course it's going to demonstrate a benefit. And there's a lot of research that shows that industry-funded studies the bias shows up in the way the research question is formulated. The science is usually pretty good, but the research question is formulated in a way to give the kind of answer that they're looking for, or the results are interpreted favorably when they may be null results. And there's a huge literature on this in the drug industry sponsorship of physicians. There's just an enormous literature. And my book, Unsavory Truth, How the Food Industry Skews the Science of What We Eat, did for food what has been done for 50 years for the drug industry, or tried to do. It's interesting. It's a book that disappeared without a trace.
Oh, interesting. Huh. So. I'm right. It's required reading in my food systems class, and this prompts two questions. One, the trivial one, but I still want to ask it, which is, what's the craziest industry-sponsored study that you've come across, or that you've been sent by your correspondents?
Oh, the one that just came in. I mean, whatever it was, whatever the most recent one is, each one is crazier than the next. I mean, every fruit and vegetable trade association is trying to demonstrate that their food is a superfood. You know, it used to be when Coca-Cola was sponsoring a lot of research that you could take off after Coca-Cola, because Coca-Cola was funding research that would demonstrate that any research that showed that there was anything wrong with sugar sweetened beverages was done so poorly that you didn't need to pay any attention to it, that physical activity is more important than what you eat and obesity, and that really sugar sweetened beverages are completely benign and you can drink as much as you want of them. But they've, they got into trouble because they were caught. Coca-Cola was caught, uh, and in um, and their emails were exposed and that kind of thing on the front page of the New York Times, and they stopped funding that kind of research. They just don't do it anymore. Uh, but any, now the big one is meat. The meat industry is really concerned about the environmental concerns about beef consumption. And so they are funding a great deal of research to demonstrate that beef raising is sustainable. Methane burping doesn't matter. If you don't eat beef, you're going to be nutritionally deprived. I mean, I could just go on and on and on. So I can't pick just one. I think it's
You love them all.
they're just
Um,
all they're just all like that.
well, so here's the more serious question, Marion, which is, as someone who didn't realize quite what the effects of this funding was doing to you, to becoming someone who's a vociferous critic on the outside, how do you see the best way of being able to sort of communicate with someone who is very much still in the nexus of the food industry, particularly when academic budgets are being cut and when it seems, again, the meat industry does this, pesticide industry does, I mean, everyone does it. And I've got colleagues who, other than the fact that they take industry funding, are perfectly lovely people,
Mhm.
and who are smart and who are engaged and who want the best for the world, but just have this aporia, this blind spot when it comes to
Mhm.
understanding how industry sponsorship works. And then when occasionally they might admit it, they'll be like, well, look, how else am I going to get this work done? There's no bloody government sponsorship. We're in Texas. They won't pay for science, but unless it's about petroleum. What do you do? How do you persuade past you or present other sort of potential comrades?
Well, I'm not sure I can. The
Mm.
I mean the main arguments are industry funding doesn't affect me. I'm not influenced by industry funding. Where else am I going to get the money? Um, but mostly it's that it doesn't affect me. And the reasons the excuses and the reasons and the rationale for taking industry funding and believing that it has no effect are so common that somebody at the University of Colorado did a conflict of interest bingo game, a satire, and published it in the British Medical Journal, in which he's got all these excuses lined up. All you have to do is read the drug industry literature, which has the influence of pharmaceutical drug companies on physicians' prescribing practices has been studied for 50 years. And so you have 50 years of voluminous research, book after book after book, thousands of articles. I'm not exaggerating, literally thousands of articles that show that physicians change their prescription practices with as little as a pad of paper and a pen with a branded drug on it. They'll switch from the generic to the branded drug. And there is so much research that shows that. And that research also shows that the physicians have absolutely no awareness that they're doing it. So the only way that you would do it, you would have to confront them individual by individual and say, but look what happened. The drug detailer came to your hospital, gave you this pad and this pen. And before this, you prescribed these drugs. After you prescribed the branded drugs. And other than that, I don't know how you would do it, and that's rather difficult to do with individuals. So all I do is keep citing the research and hope that it has an effect. What the scientists who take industry money tell me is that science is science, and they're doing good science. Why aren't you criticizing the science? Why aren't you trying to do a detailed analysis of my paper rather than just talking about the funder? because I can predict what the results of your study is if I know who funded it. And there's something wrong with that, with very, very few exceptions. There are exceptions, I will admit them, but they're very few. So I think it's an enormous problem. I think it strains the credibility of nutrition research, which is under attack anyway, and strains the credibility of nutrition professionals, especially when all these studies are coming out now about nutrition professional societies that own stock in food companies that make ultra processed and other kinds of food you really should stay away from. And how can somebody whose organization is taking money from the food industry advise the public not to eat foods that are made by companies that are paying them? I mean, that's what conflicts of interest are about. It's not, and at the very least, these conflicts of interest give the appearance of something really bad going on, even if there are individuals who aren't subject to it. I think it's very hard not to be subject to it. And, I've developed an elaborate policy about what I do about, I want to speak to food companies. I want to go to food company meetings. I want access to the people who are in those companies. I want them to know the kinds of things that I'm thinking about and what I'm worried about. And I don't want to have to pay my own bills going there. I don't pay my own bills for any other speaking engagement. I want them to pay me. I want them to pay my travel, and I want an honorarium. I don't take the honorarium. I do take the travel funds. I have them donate the honorarium.
Who do you have them donate it to?
Well, the ethicists would say this is still ethically iffy, either to my department or to the NYU library. Which are two entities that are short of funds. Particularly, there's the NYU library has a food studies collection that's named after me. I love that, and so I want to support it in any way I can. And so if I take my food industry blood money and send it there, and so I don't ever touch the funds. So I don't pay taxes on them. I don't, they just go straight to the library, and having to go through all that reminds me to be very, very careful about whether I'm changing opinion or toning things down, or not saying things because I'm afraid to offend. They really make me think through all that. And I find that helpful. And I've talked to a lot of it. I've talked to a lot of ethicists about it. They think it's okay.
Okay. Well, since we're not in the position to be able to offer you the kind of honorarium that you might get from these large companies, but we are still keen to hear what you're thinking right now. I wonder if I can ask about the current project that you're on, where I believe you're going back to some older work and revising it in the light of the dramatic changes that you've seen on the supermarket shelves. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm doing a second edition of my book, What to Eat, which came out in 2006, 15 years ago, and 16 years ago now. And it's a book that talks about food issues, but uses supermarkets as an organizing device. So I go around each section of the supermarket and talk about what the issues are in trying to make choices of foods in that area. What are the health issues? What are the sustainability issues? What are the environmental issues? What are the safety issues? Whatever they are in each section. And I thought it was going to be a quick pandemic project. I'd spend a year and knock it off. And oh, what a mistake I made, because the supermarket landscape has changed enormously, and in ways that somehow got by me because I wasn't paying attention, so that every single section raises issues that were not there 16 years ago, or or changes the focus of them so that the sustainability issues have become much more important. I mean, I'll just give a couple of
Yeah, please.
examples. The I thought, I noticed that the instead of having walls of Coca-Cola and PepsiCo at the entrance to supermarkets, it's now walls of bottled water. Fizzy water or carbonated water of one flavor or another. I shop a lot at the Wegmans in Ithaca, New York, and they have a 10-foot high wall of sparkling waters in 20 different flavors. And that's the first thing you see when you come into the store. That's new. It wasn't like that. You can hardly find Coke and Pepsi in a Wegmans where everything is store brands now. So what was that about? Where did all these things come from? What do they cost? I did if you use are they better or what's going on here? If you buy Ithaca tap water, it costs under $1 a gallon. You can take a jug and go into Wegmans and fill it up with filtered tap water and pay 70 cents for it. Whereas even the least expensive bottled water is $3.50 or something like that. And you end up paying an enormous amount by the gallon. You're paying, a minimum of $12 a gallon as compared to one. And in some of the fancy ones, you're paying $40 or $50 a gallon. And if you throw CBD into it, you're paying $100 a gallon. And you can buy CBD water. I had to do a chapter on CBD edibles because they're a big deal right now. And they weren't there 16 years ago. Some of the things that haven't changed so much are some things like supplements, where the regulations really haven't changed, and so the supplement market is still just as lucrative and just as unscientific as it's always been. But there are big changes in the meat section. There's big changes in the processed food sections. There are big changes everywhere. It's turning out to be an enormous project.
Well, let me just ask the meat question, because I know that you have to entertain it far more often than you would like, and I do too. And I'm curious about whether in your research on synthetic meat product, there's anything that surprised you.
Well, the synthetics are the other big thing. I mean, we didn't have plant-based meat 15 years ago or 16 years ago, and we certainly didn't have cell-based meat. We still don't have cell-based meat. It's not on the market yet. The other really new concept related to this is the concept of ultra-processed, which is the term used, and that term only was introduced in 2009, so it's really quite recent. And it's the term used to describe industrially produced junk foods that don't look anything like the foods they came from. You can't make them in home kitchens because they have all these industrial ingredients in them. And there's now an enormous amount of evidence that ultra-processed foods are very highly correlated with poor health outcome, obesity and obesity-related diseases, overall mortality, susceptibility to COVID-19. There's probably 1,000 studies that correlate ultra-processed food consumption with bad health outcome. Those are correlational studies, but there's also one controlled clinical trial that demonstrates that people eat more. If they're given ultra-processed foods, they eat more calories from them, lots more calories. So I say this because plant-based meats are ultra-processed. They meet the definition of ultra-processed. They're concoctions of ingredients. They don't have anything in them that resembles real food. They're pea protein or fava bean protein. That's a bad idea. Or other kind of, for people who have enormous sensitivity to fava beans, they really have to avoid anything that has that kind of protein in there. But pea protein, let's just talk about pea protein. Is pea protein good, bad, or indifferent? It's not like eating peas. So you have these ultra processed products, and I went to a meeting recently of um, animal welfare advocates at who, as far as they're concerned, these plant-based meat alternatives are fabulous because they'll help people not eat animals, and they don't want people eating animals. And we have to eat less beef if we're going to do anything about climate change. And this gives people an excuse to eat less beef, but the products are ultra processed. So how do you sort that out? I don't know. I mean, I don't do anything artificial, so ultra processed, anything that's ultra processed is off my radar. And I don't really understand. If you don't want to eat meat, you don't have to eat meat. Why do you have to eat this stuff? But not everybody agrees. And some people think that these are just really a wonderful innovation. I had one woman tell me, I'm just so happy to have these products because now I can take my kid to McDonald's.
Hmm.
So,
Oh dear, the future
yes.
is bleak, isn't it? Well, let's talk about the future, though. I mean, and perhaps by way of returning to this book. There we are. I don't know why. There we are. This fantastic book, which everyone should be ordering right now while we're talking. You can do that. But you founded food studies. The way you talk about setting up the food studies department at NYU, I think, is super interesting, and it seems to have just sort of come together in a flash. Can you tell us about that story before I ask you about the future of food studies? Can you just give us this insight into the past and how you set it up?
So I was chairing a department of home economics at NYU, and it changed. It went through several name changes. We had a hotel program that we were running only under a title of food service management, which I thought made it very vulnerable to take over, and it was taken over. And the hotel programs were moved out of our department to another school at NYU, thereby taking away a program that brought in $1 million in tuition a year. And so this was going to, the department was about to take a very, very big financial hit. And the dean asked me what I wanted to do to replace it. And I had been hanging around with Old Ways and meeting all of these food writers and chefs who were telling me that they wanted to learn more about food, that they wanted to know about the history of food. They wanted to know about the role of food in culture. They really wanted to know different ingredients. They just wanted to know more about food. And so when the dean asked me, how do you feel about having these programs taken away? I said, it depends on what I get. And she said, what do you want? I said, I want food studies. What's that? So that began what then was a multi-year discussion about what food studies is, which is a question I'm still asked, although not nearly as often. Um, and when I told her what it was and why I thought it was studyable, it's a huge industry. Everybody eats. There are big cultural issues. There are big economic issues. Billions of people are hungry and don't have enough to eat. Other billions are eating too much of the wrong kind of foods. There's plenty to study here. Uh, she said she thought she could get that and did. And so within 9 months, we had state approval for food studies, undergraduate, master's, and doctoral programs, and then had this enormous stroke of luck. The New York Times wrote about it. And we had people in our office the afternoon of the New York Times article holding the clipping in their hand, saying, I've waited all my life for this program. We had a class in the fall, and we've had classes ever since. And we didn't realize we were starting a movement because there was one other similar program at Boston University in gastronomy. And then we were it on food studies, and now there must be 70 or 80 programs in universities throughout the country. Every university teaches food courses now. And that was not the case 25 years ago. It really wasn't. So we made it academically respectable, and our program is still flourishing, and many others are too. And we get wonderful students. I love our students.
I've had the pleasure of meeting a few of them, and I agree. You do have great students. I'm wondering, when you think about, because when you put together one of these, I imagine you get to reflect on paths not taken and paths yet to come, and I'm wondering if you're thinking about, the future of food studies, and what you're hoping the direction will be, and in the process whether there are some branches you could have taken that you've yet to take but are keen to.
Well, I think one of the reasons I love our students is they come in wanting to change the world and use food to do that.
Mm.
And so the three big public health um, food systems problems, are undernutrition, making sure that everybody has enough food to eat and enough healthy food to eat. Overnutrition, obesity, and its non-communicable disease consequences, which affect billions of people all over the world now. It's an enormous problem. And then the third one is the effect of food production and consumption on climate change. So if we're going to, so the idea is to, and all of these are related to dysfunctional food systems. So the idea is to change food systems and improve them so that they will simultaneously prevent hunger, prevent chronic disease, and prevent climate change. And there are now formulations and committees working on this, and the general idea is that in order to do this, you need to eat a diet that has less meat, less beef particularly, more fruits and vegetables, and less ultra processed foods. And if people change their diets and move their dietary practices into diets that contain less meat, more fruits and more plant foods, and less ultra processed foods, they would be eating more healthfully, and it would be kinder to the planet. It would generate fewer greenhouse gases. So, fortunately, the same diet that's good for health is the same diet that's good for climate change, so that you can talk about triple duty diets that do all three things at once. And and some very good things have been written about this. The barriers are political, obviously, because the food industry makes its money from selling animal products. It doesn't make its money, their big food does not make its money from growing fruits and vegetables. Famously, the United States Department of Agriculture considers fruits and vegetables to be specialty crops, famously. And the big money makers for the packaged food industry are ultra processed foods. So if you want to change the food system, you're coming up against very impressive political barriers. You're coming up with coming up against a food industry which with one goal, which is to sell more products. And I, of course, think that that goal has contributed to people eating too much food and gaining weight. Um, and enormous political barriers, which, in the case of the United States, means a government that's sold out to corporations. This has been completely captured by corporations, as far as I can tell, uh, and a civil society that's not organized and unwilling to take on this as an issue for common cause. I worry a lot that the food movement in the United States, it's called the food movement, but it contains thousands of small organizations working on food issues of one kind or another, and they're all competing with each other for the same funding. Um, and they're not united and joined together to try to work towards common issues. And until they do that, they won't have any kind of political power to speak of. Whereas food companies can hire lobbyists as full-time people who are working full-time on trying to convince Congress not to do anything to regulate them.
Are you given any pause, or rather, is there any hope that you see from, for example, the sort of latest sort of resurgence of, say, union activity? It's interesting that while it may be that the movements trying to push back against, the meat manufacturers, for example, on the grounds of ultra processed ultra processed food might be doing not as great as one might hope. But there does seem to have been, particularly through the pandemic, much more understanding about how workers are both, in the front lines of the food system and woefully underpaid as a result. Is there? I don't want to force you into a sort of Pollyannish moment here, but I'm wondering if you see anything that you see as particularly promising, if not yet the sort of the promised land when it comes to transforming the food system. At least some nugget of hope, given that this is going to be
plenty of, I see plenty of nuggets. Yeah, I see plenty of nuggets, mainly in the understanding. If the pandemic did any good at all, it was to demonstrate to everybody that about food chains. Who knew anything about food chains before the pandemic? Now everybody understands that the supply chains are screwed up and need to be fixed. Nobody knew anything about meat processing plants. And the idea that workers were squeezed together under enormously crowded conditions, and they were developing COVID like mad, and there were enormous number of deaths and an enormous number of illnesses. And the president intervened and signed an executive order to keep the plant open, even while all this was going on. And then there was a big ProPublica investigation, and they found out that the meat industry had written that executive order. I mean, those are revelations that investigative reporters would have an enormous amount of trouble explaining to people. And there they were on the front page of newspapers, and lots of people caught on to it right away. So I think the understanding of the politics behind food has increased enormously. I would say 5 years ago, maybe 10 years. If I used the word capitalism in class, it would turn the class off instantly. I would have lost the class instantly by the time the M came out in capitalism. They were gone. Now, if I don't use the word capitalism, somebody in the class is saying, but aren't you talking about capitalism? I think that's a big shift. I don't know where that shift is going to go. I don't know how it's going to get used. But I think understanding of the unfairness of the current system has reached a much, much broader audience. At issue is what to do about it. And that's where I hope our students are going to come in and figure out ways. I mean, it's too late for me. All I can do is cheer them on. But I hope that our students are going to be working on these issues. They say they want to. Their big problem is how are they going to get paid to do that? But that's what they're interested in, is how do we change the system? They're talking about food system. But changing the food system means changing the way capitalism works. And it's really worth working on. I think it's tremendously worth working on. And everybody understands about food. It's really easy to talk about it. Everybody eats. Everybody gets it. So that's where I see the glimmers of hope. Whether you can do anything about our enormously divided society, whether you can do anything about the dug-in half of our society that really doesn't want things to become more fair or more just, I don't know. We'll find out.
Well, Marion, I think that's why we must have socialism and communism. You've returned us to the beginning of our conversation so beautifully. I remember saying the word capitalism at Berkeley 10, 15 years ago, and you're right. It was like I'd farted in a lift. And now, of course, it is it's something where we are looking for alternatives. And I'm so grateful you were brought up in one that allowed you to not only write this fantastic book, Slow Cooked, go get it now from your local independent bookstore, but also just to be able to spawn the possibilities of being able to articulate food consumption, climate, labor, and planetary destruction, but in a way that then opens up the possibility for us to do something about it. Marion Nestle, thank you so much for your time today and for all your work and for your friendship. It's been lovely.
Thank you very much. And for yours too. I love talking to you.